Joining us now is Tony Gosling, investigative journalist from Bristol, and Mr. Max Parry, geopolitical analyst, joining us out of New York. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program. I guess we'll start there in the UK alphabetically and then head over to the US. Tony, hope you're safe and doing well. Your initial thoughts on the story here?
Well, look, what we're seeing is an increase in the tit for tat between Russia and the West. So expulsions of diplomats, closing down of journalists, sending them home. Anyone taking a look at this dispassionately must be able to realize that we are actually inching towards a real fighting conflict of some sort, unless this is reversed. I mean, this is a very, very serious situation, possibly more serious than the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which, of course, was all over the press at the time. Now, the big difference is the press is turning a blind eye to all of this, even though even during the 1960s crisis, where there was threat of nuclear war, the Russian diplomats and the US diplomats stayed in Moscow and Washington. There was no expulsion of ambassadors, no asking any ambassadors to go home or anything like that. So we had, even right the way back and to the Russian Revolution, Russian and Soviet ambassadors in Washington. Now there's none of that. So that's the big danger here, is that we've got a media which is deliberately right across the West in a kind of groupthink, the sort of thing described by George Orwell, pointing everybody in the wrong direction and making sure that nobody sees this slow slide towards a conflict, which, if it does begin to, literally break out, then it will come as a total surprise. Now, that won't be a surprise to many people in other parts of the world because they're not listening to the same treacherous media.
Interesting stuff. Thanks. And Max, how do you interpret it? Welcome to the program, bud. And how do you interpret what's going on? I mean, do you agree with Tony as far as the severity of the buildup of tensions we've seen over the last weeks with NATO, Kiev, and the U.S. on one side and the Russians on the other?
Well, I do agree with Tony that it appears that, the United States and its Western allies and Russia appear to be sleepwalking into what could very well be another world war. But I don't think that there can be any adequate discussion of this diplomatic crisis between the EU and Russia that's clearly being instigated by the United States without taking into consideration the timing of these events, whether it's the alleged poisoning and subsequent jailing of Mr. Navalny, or the escalation of the conflict in eastern Ukraine, because both of these developments are not only the result of instigations by the U.S., but the U.S. is desperate to halt the rise of Moscow on the global arena. And one area of interest in particular is the economic ties between Moscow and the EU, where Russia remains the top supplier of natural gas to European countries at 30% of the market share, which is a figure that's only expected to rise in the coming decades, especially amid the pending completion of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline with Germany, which the U.S. is dead set on terminating. And when it was nearing completion, that's when this chain of events, starting with Navalny, the dubious circumstances of his poisoning, and now the inflammation of tensions in eastern Ukraine are skyrocketing. I mean, that's what set this chain of events in motion. So I think any conversation about this, in order to understand, what's really going on, you just have to ask cui bono, who benefits from, who stands to benefit from this crisis. And it's certainly not Russia, and it's absolutely Washington, which is desperate to undermine Moscow's economic foothold in the European Union.
And Tony, how do we get here so fast, so early on in Joe Biden's tenure? Because we can't say he really inherited these tensions from Donald Trump, because he didn't. So what happened in such a short period of time since he assumed office?
Well, look, I think what we're seeing is quite a lot of speaking with forked tongue, to put it politely, where, for example, they're saying, oh, we want to stop this negative trend in these expulsions. I don't think there's any real wish to do that at all. I think this negative trend is planned all along, in a similar way that we've seen the former Secretary of State and a war criminal, Henry Kissinger, saying, oh, the world is going to have to get together and sort out the COVID crisis. There could be a much wider conflict. I think he's the sort of person that is actually setting China and the United States against each other. This is his bread and butter, this kind of thing. So whilst we're seeing a lot of voices, particularly powerful people, saying they want to see an end to this, actually they're the sorts of people who basically want to control the outcome. They want to control an outcome, and they don't really, they should not be being listened to, but they are, of course, by the mass media, who's making people look in the wrong direction, as I said before. But look, the Russians have got a lot of independence. They're an independent-minded lot. They're an Orthodox Christian country which had to go through many decades of having Christianity made an outlaw effectively by the communists during the Soviet era. Wonderful cathedrals smashed down to the ground, that sort of thing. They rebuilt a lot of that, and they are not likely to be pushed around by the Protestant or Catholic countries.
Interesting. And Max, do you think that Zelensky in Ukraine right now, in Kiev, should be concerned that the West doesn't about face on him, kind of like akin to what we saw in Syria, where they pumped up the Kurds, they pumped up the insurgency, that let's do this together, and then they went from that to, hey, let's you do it by yourself, and we'll back you with weapons and logistics, to, hey, let's you do it by yourself, and we'll just sit back and watch.
Well, unfortunately, I think that Mr. Zelensky has proven to be just as bellicose and has beaten the drums of war just as much as his predecessor, Petro Poroshenko, because it was, after all, Mr. Zelensky who issued a decree that, stated Kiev's intention that it was going to retake the Crimean Peninsula and the Donbass from the Russian-speaking separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk, and the Crimea from Russia, which, of course, was intended to provoke a reaction by Moscow, and Russia responded accordingly, as any country would, by moving its armies and divisions towards its western region and its warships into the Black Sea. It was actually Mr. Zelensky that really, has been saber-rattling Russia here and provoked this troop buildup by Russia, which is really in self-defense. It was argued that, during his campaign versus Mr. Poroshenko, he was, trying to play both sides. But ultimately, I think Zelensky has proven to be just as much of a Western puppet and, under and an acolyte for NATO as much as his predecessors. So I think that if the U.S. wants to use Ukraine as a cat's paw for imperialism against Russia, Zelensky is going to be a puppet willing to go along with it, unfortunately. And so far, the U.S.'s aims of undermining Russia's influence on the EU by using Ukraine and instigating the conflict in Donbass has worked like a charm, because now you see as these diplomacy is being criminalized, where diplomats are being expelled, and now they're involving other countries like the Czech Republic, and NATO member states are under pressure to follow the West, the U.S. and Britain in their hostility. So, unfortunately, I think that Ukraine is going to continue to go along with the anti-Russian narrative until diplomacy is really restored.
All right, and Tony, we have about less than a minute left. Your final thoughts on this, especially how you expect things to play out, especially with respect to Ukraine's fate.
Well, yes, obviously Ukraine is one of the hot spots around the world for all these tensions. I'd like to think that we've just seen a show of strength by the Russians, which has made it clear to the West that there's nothing they can really do there. They have to just keep the peace, which is what the people want in all those areas. They want to keep the peace. But look, they're being painted that the Russians are somehow. I don't believe they are. I think it's the Western establishment that's becoming isolated by their own unhinged behaviour. If you look, last Saturday in London, we had 500,000 people on the streets protesting against the strictures of the lockdown rules, plus also a bill which would criminalise. It's called the Kill the Bill movement. That could criminalise up to 1 million people in Britain who are on the edge of homelessness. So we've got a massive insurrection going on in Britain, which is virtually unreported in the Western press. 500,000 people on the streets. That's probably the biggest demonstration that there's been since the Iraq war demonstration in 2003, where we saw roughly 2 million people on the streets. So a massive thing going on in Britain, which they're trying to, again, to turn a blind. I think that the West establishment is just simply becoming increasingly isolated, and quite where that one goes, I'm afraid I just cannot predict.
All right, gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Do stay safe till we see you both again. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist there, joining us from Bristol. Mr. Max Parry, geopolitical analyst, joining us out of New York. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's news review program. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now.